The ride-sharing apps Lyft and Uber have announced they will cover 100% of legal fees for any of their drivers who are sued under the Texas abortion law. Democratic lawmakers are weighing their next move in the meantime, now that the Supreme Court has refused to block that new law, virtually banning abortion in Texas. Reporters at Axios write this. Democrats say they're itching for a political fight over abortion rights and that it will help them in the 2022 midterms. But even if they're right, they're still losing the war. With us to talk about it, Victoria DeFrancesco Soto, professor and assistant dean at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas in Austin, and Bill Kristol, author, writer, thinker, politico, veteran of the Reagan and Bush administrations, and editor-at-large at The Bulwark. Great to have both of you here. So, Victoria, this is your state. Do you see what happened as helping Democrats across the country in 2022? And even if so, are they losing the war?
Right. So let me break those two questions up, Chris. I think nationally it can help mobilize, right? That this is an issue that is very important for the Democratic base. It's also something that we've seen moderate Republican women and independent women also feel very, very strongly about. So I think at the general level, yes, we know that nationally the majority of Americans support the rights of women to a safe abortion. The difference is when we look at Texas, we're more conservative, right? So we are almost evenly split in terms of support for this law. So while I do think that in other states outside of Texas, especially those that are purple or blue, it will help. In Texas, I'm not so sure. We see that split. We know among Republican women, they're almost as supportive as men are. So I think that we have to be careful in terms of how broad a swath we cover when we say it will help Democrats. We need to look at the specific states and even more specifically, the district.
David Frum writes this in The Atlantic, quote, accountability has suddenly arrived. Texas Republicans have just elevated abortion rights to perhaps the state's supreme ballot issue in 2022. Perhaps they have calculated correctly. If that's the case, that's an important political fact and one that will reshape the politics of the country in 2024, which raises the question, Bill Kristol, have Republicans calculated correctly?
I doubt it. And 2 points. I'm here in Virginia. We're having a gubernatorial race going on right now in real time. Terry McAuliffe, the Democratic candidate, who's ahead by 3, 5, 7 points. Not a slaughter, though. It's a bluish state, but not a safe blue state. And there's people who are tired a little bit of Democratic governors for the last 8 years and so forth. McAuliffe is hammering his opponent on this issue. He's saying we can't be like Texas. I will preserve the right to an abortion here in Virginia, and we can't have a system like Texas. The Republican nominee is ducking the issue. He ducked questions yesterday on it. Earlier, he was taped by a liberal activist saying, talking to a supporter of his who said, are you going to really take care of the abortion issue? Are you going to be aggressive? And he says something like, well, I can't talk about it too much now, but if I'm in there with a Republican assembly, then we'll go on the offense. And the McAuliffe campaign is highlighting the Republican statements on this. So Youngkin's statements on this. So it tells me that here in Virginia, at least, Terry McAuliffe, who's a savvy politician, thinks this is a winning issue for him. That doesn't mean it is everywhere in the country.
Well, let me ask you about that, because for decades, the argument has been, while it certainly energizes a small portion of the electorate, in the end, it's not something that most people vote on. Is it going to be elevated to that level where more people in more parts of the country will consider this seriously when they cast their votes?
So I think so here in Virginia. I think there's not just a Democratic base, as was said. I mean, there are a ton of independent voters, Romney Biden voters, so to speak, who don't want the kind of law we've got in Texas. We'll see if Youngkin has the nerve to distance himself from that, but he's very nervous about alienating his base. The other thing I would say is, let's see what happens in Texas. Are we going to have stories over the next 2, 4, 6, 8 weeks of people being sort of persecuted by bounty seekers? I mean, I don't think we're in a static situation here. It's not like the law got passed and now everyone just sits back and has a theoretical debate. There are real things that are going to be happening on the ground. There are going to be court cases, challenges in Texas courts and lower federal courts. Parts of the law are going to be thrown out, I think. So I think it's a dynamic situation. And I've got to think that this is not going to work out well for the Republicans. I think it's going to be a harder law to defend 3 months from now, even by pro-life voters in Texas, than it is today.
And Victoria, he's right. This is not static. I mean, you, again, have Lyft and Uber that are going to pay legal fees. Now it looks like South by Southwest, the huge festival, people know it, in Austin, could be facing boycotts, advertisers talking about pulling out, actors, producers talking about reconsidering whether they should shoot in Texas. I don't know that that's going to change the minds of Republican state lawmakers, but do those things matter?
So, Chris, you and I have talked about this before. In the short term, the political calculations of the Republican lawmakers are focused on next year's election. So all of our state executives are up for election. Governor Abbott is up for re-election. So there's that one political calculation that we need to keep in mind. The second one is that Governor Abbott has his eye on the 2024 GOP nomination, and he sees this taking a stand on abortion, in addition to immigration and guns and other stuff that plays to the base, as being something that will secure him that presidential nomination. So even though there are these threats, there's going to be court cases, there's going to be a lot of legal fees, you know, folks may boycott us. I think that that narrow view of the political strategy is what is going to be driving the leadership, at least for the short term.
And we've asked Victoria and Bill to both stay put through this next short break, because coming up, there is growing concern over a possible repeat of January 6th, just 2 weeks from now. We'll get into the deep divides in this country that only seem to be getting deeper when Deadline White House continues. He is one of the most recognizable figures of the January 6th attack. He's the suspect known as the QAnon shaman. There you see him on the right. Today, Jacob Anthony Chansley pleaded guilty to a single federal charge of felony obstruction of justice, a felony obstruction of an official proceeding. According to the New York Times, his plea hearing in federal district court in Washington departed from the circus-like atmosphere that has surrounded the case from the start. Under the terms of his deal, Mr. Chansley agreed to accept a recommended 41 to 51 months in prison. He is scheduled to be sentenced on November 17th. Back with us, Victoria DeFrancesco Soto and Bill Kristol. You know, Bill, on one side, you have folks like him who believe the big lie, who were planning, and now talking to Frank Figliuzzi just a short time ago, it may not be happening at the Capitol, but folks who were planning another protest because they believe that the folks who have been charged, like Mr. Chansley, are political prisoners. On the other side, you have folks who believe that there is something profoundly wrong and who are fighting, frankly, as strongly as they can because they believe that democracy is the very democracy that we depend on is at stake. And I wonder, as you look at how all of this has developed over the last many years and several months, have we finally gotten to a low point, or is it going to still get worse before it gets better as we see this divide in our country?
Well, it's pretty bad, Chris, and it's really bad on the Republican side. Democrats have their problems, but this is, I mean, the degree to which we have a tolerance of and even encouragement of violence, mob rule, people taking things into their own hands on the Republican side, whether it's January 6th, whether it's storming, in effect, school board meetings and threatening people, who are saying you should wear a mask, or now trying to prevent people from getting vaccinated with kind of mob scenes outside of vaccine sites. Whether it's this Texas law, which is interesting, right? It does kind of create a kind of mob rule. The state doesn't enforce things with the normal accountability that comes with that, even if it can sometimes be violated by individual police officers or whatever. So put it all together, you have a Republican Party that I think in an unprecedented way is edging towards a kind of mob rule, giving a yellow light, if not a green light, to violence. And a very dangerous situation.
And it started at the top, right, Victoria, the president, on January 6th. But look at what Kevin McCarthy did just this week. I mean, the January 6th Select Committee reportedly, you know, looking for the communications and social media company to preserve the records of hundreds of people, but in particular some members of Congress. And then you have McCarthy threatening to retaliate against any company that complies. What does that tell you about where we are?
that McCarthy's political calculation is very squarely in the Trump camp. And we've seen him going to visit President Trump, also in him contemplating taking Liz Cheney off of the January 6th commission. So we can see where we are. The question is, as we get closer to the midterm election, and remember, we're going to be coming up on the midterm election after a round of redistricting, does this hold? Is this going to have legs, or was this just a bad couple of years? Is this the Trump hangover, or is this really an institutional shift in the Republican Party? And I think that's what is going to become clear after 2022 and 2024. And in terms of the rally that's going to be happening later this month, I'm watching it really closely, Chris, because I can see it happening in one of two ways. One, it's a repeat of January 6th, God forbid. The second is they try to mainstream it, because it's really interesting to hear the rhetoric around January 6th. They were tourists. These are folks who have their First Amendment rights. So it'd be interesting to see if there's going to be a shift in trying to normalize the rhetoric that we saw and say, we're just normal people who are exercising our democratic rights.
We have less than a minute left, but that letter did go out to Leader McCarthy. Andy Biggs wants both Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger gone. He writes, Congresswoman Cheney and Congressman Kinzinger are two spies for the Democrats that we currently invite to meetings despite our inability to trust them. He wants a rule change to remove them from the Republican conference. What does Kevin McCarthy do now? Bill?
I assume he tries to ignore that. That's been his style, but it is unbelievable that they want Liz Cheney and Kinzinger removed from the conference. Marjorie Taylor Greene, Paul Gosar, Lauren Boebert, Matt Gaetz, they're all fine. They're all fine.
Yeah. Bill Kristol, Victoria DeFrancesco Soto, thank you both. Have a great holiday weekend.